Hey guys, tonight we drift into the glittering world of French royalty, but not the powdered wigs or polished mirrors you might expect, not the royal decrees or grand military victories, but the strange, meticulous, and often downright bizarre daily habits of one man, King Louis XIV, within the golden cage of Versailles. This isn't about the Sun King's power. It's about his rituals, his obsessions, his public wake-up routines, and the strange theatre of control he built around himself. Before we tiptoe into his world, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if this kind of deep dive historical storytelling is your thing. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is on your end. I love seeing how far this little history circle reaches. Now, lower the lights, maybe light a candle, or just let the screen glow softly in the dark. And let's step behind the velvet curtains of Versailles to witness the peculiar life of a king who made everything, even waking up, a performance. It begins not with the sun, but with the man who claimed to embody it. The king's day, le lever du roi, began at precisely 8:30 a.m. But this was no sleepy shuffle into the morning. It was a ceremony, a carefully orchestrated performance, attended by dozens, sometimes more. And at the centre of it all, lying in a gilded bed beneath an embroidered canopy, was Louis XIV, the Sun King. But he wasn't really waking up. He'd already stirred an hour earlier, in private. That was the petit lever, the small waking where he handled more personal tasks, relieving himself, perhaps reading correspondence, sometimes speaking in low tones to his closest valet. That moment was his, and his alone, but the real show began only once the doors were flung open and the courtiers flooded in. It was then that the king, already awake, already composed, would pretend to stir from slumber like some divine being descending from dreams. The crowd, composed of nobles desperate for favour, lined up in ranked layers of privilege. Each person had a role, a place, a moment. Some were allowed to hand him his shirt. Others might be granted the honour of buckling his shoes. For most, it was enough to simply be in the room. Imagine that, waking up in front of 200 people and still being considered the most private man in the room. It was less about personal grooming and more about power. Louis understood that control didn't just come from issuing laws, it came from controlling the air others breathed. The king's body was a stage. Every gesture, every step, every morning yawn was political theatre. And it didn't stop at the edge of the bed. Each motion, rising, sitting, turning, was done with a gravitas, like a priest in the middle of mass. His servants would hand him clothing piece by piece, reciting their ranks as if to remind the others that even being allowed to pass a sleeve was a sacred privilege. If you looked closely, you'd see something even stranger. Many of these nobles didn't want to be there out of duty. They wanted to be there because being seen with the king was everything. To be absent from the waking meant being absent from power. Versailles ran on visibility. And Louis XIV? He made sure he was always the sun at the centre of that orbit. The ritual could last more than an hour. And by the end of it, Louis hadn't just gotten dressed. He had reminded every noble in the kingdom who held the strings. There's something haunting about that. Waking up not to bird song or silence, but to the breathless attention of those who both loved and feared you, who sought your gaze like lifeblood, who might kill for the privilege of handing you your gloves. And Louis, he basked in it. This wasn't ego, it was strategy. He had grown up in chaos. The Fronde Rebellion, when nobles rose up against the monarchy, had scarred him as a child. From then on he believed, control the nobles or be devoured by them. And so he built Versailles, like a golden spiderweb. Gorgeous, glittering, but tight. A trap, a stage, a cage masked as paradise. And every morning the trap was baited anew with his own awakening. But here's the question that lingers in the folds of his silk sheets. What happens to a man who lives his entire life as a performance? Imagine lying still, while someone fixes your cuffs, smiling while you're handed your wig, turning at the right angle so the sunlight catches the embroidery just so. Do you forget where the performance ends and the person begins? Did Louis? At Versailles. You couldn't sneeze without someone ranking who had passed you the handkerchief. Every gesture was watched, noted, remembered, and Louis made sure to control every one of his. There was no room for vulnerability, no privacy, no off switch. And yet, that's what made the weirdness work. Because when waking up becomes theatre, so does everything else. Louis XIV turned his entire life into a spectacle. He ruled not just with armies or decrees, but with shadow-potent symbols. A glance could change someone's fortune. A frown could freeze a man's blood. All of it began here, in the morning, with a fake waking, with a golden bed, with a room full of men watching one man rise. So next time you wake up groggy, shuffling toward your coffee machine, think of Louis. Think of the trumpets in his halls, the silent shuffle of velvet slippers as nobles crept forward for a glimpse. Think of how a single yawn, performed with grace, could decide a man's future. And then ask yourself, would you trade your quiet for his gold? Because at Versailles, even opening your eyes was never just your own. If you were lucky enough to attend the lever, the royal waking, you might witness something else shortly after. Something you might not expect from a man called the Sun King. The second odd ritual in Louis XIV's morning wasn't about fashion or policy or fanfare. It was about defecation. Yes, truly. Every morning after waking, Louis would relieve himself in what was called the chaise percée, literally, the pierced chair, a velvet-covered commode, ornate and padded, complete with armrests and carved wood, and beneath the seat, a chamber pot. This was no private trip to the loo. This was yet another event, attended by servants, nobles, and often favoured courtiers. They stood nearby chatting idly, sometimes discussing matters of state, while the king did his business. Right there in the room, no curtain, no breakfast, just royal flesh, ritualised digestion, and the soft scrape of porcelain. How did this become normal? Because under Louis XIV, everything was power, even his bowel movements. The act of being present for the king's most human moments was, paradoxically, considered an honour. A noble might walk away from such a moment proudly declaring, "I was with the king during his morning stool." And it wasn't a joke. It was status. It was intimacy, the kind only the truly privileged could access. But the absurdity runs deeper. There were ranks even within this bizarre ceremony. Only certain people were allowed to hand the king his perfumed handkerchief afterward. Only a few could pass the warm towel. One or two, carefully chosen, might comment on his health based on the results. It's no wonder Versailles has been described as a court of golden cages and brown realities. But there was method behind this madness. Louis understood something modern politics has barely caught up with. Visibility equals dominance. The more people see you, the more they believe in you. The more they witness, the more they internalize your rule as part of their own daily existence. Even your excrement becomes sacred if wrapped in ritual. And let's not pretend this was just a quirk of Louis's personal tastes. It was institutionalized. The royal household had dozens of different chamber pots. Specialized staff were in charge of cleaning, transporting, and scenting them. There was a ritual to how the pot was removed, how it was carried, and who was allowed to speak during its procession. We might laugh today, but back then, this was Versailles. It made perfect, bizarre, courtly sense. What's more, it set the tone for everyone else. Courtiers began mimicking the king's routine. They too would dine publicly, wake publicly, and even discuss their own bodily habits with a weird kind of pride. In a place where access meant survival, the line between the sacred and the mundane blurred. The king sneezed, applauded his divine lungs. The king scratched himself, a symbol of thoughtful contemplation. The king passed gas, well, perhaps a noble signal that conversation was over. But beneath the layers of court ritual and scented oils, there's something deeply unsettling here. What happens to a man who is never allowed to be alone? Louis XIV lived for over 70 years. For most of that time, he was watched, waited on, followed, flattered, studied. His body, his habits, even his most intimate functions were spectacles. Imagine the weight of that. Imagine living in a place so ceremonial that not even your digestion is your own. And here's the thing. Louis wasn't doing this because he was vain. Not entirely. He believed in the sacred body of the monarch, a concept stretching back centuries in French political theology. The king was the nation. His flesh, his health, his sweat, his bowels, they were all extensions of France itself. If the king was regular, the kingdom was in balance. If he was ill, the land was troubled. This strange symbiosis fueled much of Versailles' weirdness. So while today we might recoil at the thought of dozens of powdered courtiers standing beside a royal commode back then, it made spiritual, political, and social sense. Twisted maybe, but perfectly logical in the context of court life. And Louis played it perfectly. He understood the game so well that he became its master and its prisoner. He couldn't change it, even if he wanted to. If he ever demanded privacy, people would whisper, "Is he sick? Is the kingdom at risk? Is he hiding something? So he performed, every day, even on the toilet. But here's a small, almost heartbreaking detail. Occasionally, when everyone was dismissed and the doors were finally closed, Louis would sit in silence, eyes cast toward nothing, just breathing. The velvet, the chamber pot, the incense gone from his thoughts. Just a man in a gilded room tired from a life of performance. And for those few minutes, he wasn't the Sun King. He was just Louis, a man with strange habits, a man burdened by gold, a man who turned even the bathroom into a crown. Versailles was a palace, yes, but it was also a stage, a never-ending play with Louis XIV as both actor and author. If his bedchamber was the scene of daily resurrection, and his commode a throne of earthy control, then the Hall of Mirrors was the altar, the place where image, light, and illusion merged into something far more powerful than stone or sword: reputation. Stretching over 240 feet, lined with 17 arched windows and directly opposite 17 identical mirrors, the Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors, was unlike anything France had seen before. By daylight it glowed with sunbeams caught and reflected 100 times. By candlelight it shimmered like liquid fire. But it wasn't built for beauty alone. It was built to control what people saw. Louis XIV understood something that modern celebrity culture has only begun to grasp. People don't follow reality. They follow the curated version of it. And so he gave them reflections, literally. It might seem odd today, but mirrors in the 17th century were outrageously expensive. Luxury items reserved for only the wealthiest. Venice had a monopoly on their manufacture, and France had no significant production until Louis himself invested in the industry. Not for trade, not for household goods, but for Versailles. The Hall of Mirrors became his statement to the world. I am so powerful I can capture light. I can multiply my image endlessly, and I can force you to see me, even when I am not there. And here's where the weirdness sets in. The mirrors weren't just decorative, they served a psychological purpose. They shattered privacy. In that great hallway you could not hide. Every turn of your head, every gesture, every raised eyebrow was bounced and refracted around the room. No whispered gossip escaped the reflection. No expression went unseen. Louis would often walk slowly through this hall, deliberately catching his reflection in dozens of angles. His courtiers would watch him watch himself, unsure if they were supposed to comment or simply stand in reverent silence. He used his own image like a weapon. A mirror wasn't a vanity, it was surveillance. He once reportedly told a visiting ambassador, "Versailles is my eye. If I do not see it, it does not happen." That wasn't metaphor. He quite literally designed the palace so his presence, his face, his silhouette, could never fully vanish, even when he was in another wing. In a sense, Louis became omnipresent. It wasn't enough to be obeyed. He had to be seen being obeyed. And the Hall of Mirrors, with its dizzying repetition of his power, ensured no one ever forgot whose palace they were walking in. But the effect on those within was disorienting. Imagine a space where everything shines, gilded furniture, crystal chandeliers, floor polished like water. And imagine yourself inside it, never sure if someone is watching, never sure if the reflection across the hall is your own or the king's. Many courtiers grew paranoid. Some developed nervous tics, subtle ones, like adjusting their cuffs, retying their cravat too often, or constantly checking their reflection to ensure they were composed. In this glittering cage, you were always on stage, always watched, always performing, even alone. But perhaps no one was more affected by this than Louis himself. He'd glance at his reflection not just for vanity, but to remind himself who he was supposed to be. The mirrors became confirmation of identity, a sort of ritual. Yes, there he is, the king, the sun, the centre of it all. There's something unsettling about that. What happens when you start to believe your reflection more than your reality? Did Louis XIV ever pass by a mirror and not recognise the man staring back? Did he ever feel trapped by the endless versions of himself, smiling, posing, commanding, while some quieter part of him longed to just vanish into shadow? And yet, he couldn't stop. The palace thrived on reflection. And Louis? He kept building them. In smaller salons, in passageways, even in the Queen's apartments, always more mirrors, more glass, more versions of the same story. The king is everywhere, and you are nowhere without him. The Hall of Mirrors became more than a gallery. It was a political machine. Royal treaties were signed there. Victories were celebrated. Foreign dignitaries were awed into silence as they walked its length, overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of it all. But one strange little fact remains. Despite the grandeur, the candles used at night were ordinary tallow candles. The smell of animal fat sometimes lingered under the glitter. The wax dripped messily, and servants had to sweep constantly. Occasionally the glass warped. Cheap silvering techniques left streaks and blemishes. The perfection, in other words, was an illusion. Much like the king's daily performance, all of it, the mirrors, the reflections, the grand processions, they created a kind of controlled hallucination, where power appeared absolute, but behind the curtain it was fragile, painstakingly maintained, and deeply, deeply weird. And Louis knew this. He knew Versailles was a house of cards, but he also knew no one dared to blow on it while he was watching, and in the Hall of Mirrors he was always watching. When Louis XIV sat down to eat, it wasn't for sustenance alone. It was a production, a meticulously crafted event known as the Grand Couvert, the king's public dinner. An audience of courtiers, diplomats, and curious onlookers would gather in hushed anticipation, not to dine themselves, but to watch him eat. Yes, you heard that right. They stood in silence behind velvet ropes or along the edges of the room, dozens, sometimes hundreds, simply to witness the king slowly cut into a leg of roast pheasant, or lift a spoonful of bouillon to his lips. And Louis, he dined with the serenity of a man performing an opera. But why? Because at Versailles, even chewing became an act of power. The ritual began in the evening, usually between 10 and 10:30 p.m. Yes, late by modern standards, but Versailles operated by its own clock, and that clock ticked to the rhythm of the king. Louis would be seated alone at a long, ornate table in the royal dining room. Gilded chairs surrounded him, empty but suggestive. 4 noblemen were allowed to serve him diaconally, each with a strictly defined role. One might carry the napkin, another the knife, another the plate. Each act of service was tightly choreographed and deeply symbolic. The king didn't serve himself, of course. Dishes were announced aloud as they entered, sometimes as many as 30 or 40 courses over the meal. Not all were eaten. Many were there simply to be seen. Like jewels on a platter, they testified to the abundance, refinement, and reach of the French crown. And here's the strangest part. Most people in the room were not there to speak, socialize, or even dine. They were there to observe. A hush would fall over the room when the king lifted his fork. Gasps might ripple if he smiled at a dish. If he pushed something aside, murmurs would follow. Was it overcooked? Did it displease him? Was this a signal to the court? His preferences became law. One courtier noted that after the king showed interest in a particular white asparagus dish, it was suddenly being served at every noble table from Paris to Provence. Another time he simply mentioned that he liked soft-boiled eggs with mushrooms, and within a week local markets were sold out of mushrooms for miles. The ripple effect was real. But here's where the weirdness deepens. Louis ate with his hands far more than we might expect. Forks were still a luxury, and while they were available, they weren't always preferred. He would often tear bread, dip it into sauces, pick meat from bones. Yet even this was part of the performance. To dine like the king was to signal loyalty. Nobles mimicked not just his manner of speech, but his table habits, down to the angle at which he held his spoon. And what was Louis's favourite dish? Not some exotic delicacy or grandiose feast. It was simple roast meat, especially lamb or duck with rich sauces on the side. He was famously fond of soups and stews, and he had a powerful sweet tooth. Candied fruit, tarts, and sugared almonds frequently appeared on his table. But food was not just a pleasure, it was a tool. To invite someone to dine at the king's table, even briefly, was the pinnacle of favour. To be seen eating beside him, even if you never spoke a word, meant your social stock had risen. And if you were granted the unimaginable privilege of handing him a napkin, you had arrived. It sounds ridiculous today, but in Louis's court, where attention meant survival, proximity was everything. Even the food itself was a message. It wasn't just French cuisine, it was France, plated. Imported spices from the colonies, game from royal forests, bread baked with wheat from carefully chosen farms. Every bite the king took was an economic statement. Now, consider this strange detail. Louis almost never dined completely alone. Even when there were no guests, there were always eyes, always watchers, servants, guards, pages. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with the weight of silent observation. It is said that once, in his later years, he whispered to his valet after a meal, "Do you think they'd still clap if I choked?" Was it a joke? A moment of dark reflection? No one knows, but it reveals a tension that always simmered beneath the gold and silver. When every act is a performance, can you ever truly eat in peace? There were more private meals, of course. The petit couvert was a more intimate affair, sometimes just him and select members of his household, but even those were observed by staff and often subject to unexpected visitors seeking an audience during dessert. Even food in Louis's world became a language, and every plate, every sip of wine, every crumb wiped from his lips was loaded with silent meaning. Here's a minor but telling example. At one point, Louis took to drinking wine diluted with water. It was likely for health reasons. He suffered from gout, and his doctors were cautious, but soon nobles began ordering their wine the same way. Entire kitchens restructured their drink service, and before long, Louis-style wine, 1 part wine, 2 parts water, was the new symbol of refined taste. No decree was issued, no command given, just a subtle shift at the royal table, and the nation followed. It's absurd, it's impressive, it's deeply strange, and that's the point. Versailles was a palace of mirrors, yes, but it was also a palace of mimicry. Everyone echoed the king, not because they admired him, but because to do anything else was to risk falling out of the sun's warmth. So imagine, if you will, Louis XIV seated beneath flickering chandeliers, lifting a silver spoon to his lips as silence falls across the room. Plates glisten, steam curls. No one speaks. They're waiting, not for the taste, not for the flavour, but for the king to choose. Because at Versailles, dinner was never just about food. It was about being seen at the table of God. By now, you've probably guessed, there was very little that Louis XIV did in private. But perhaps the strangest extension of this royal exhibitionism was how he slept. Or rather, how he performed sleeping. At Versailles, the king didn't simply go to bed. He didn't just drift into sleep behind closed doors, tucked away from the eyes of the world. No, he went to sleep like a priest entering sacred slumber. As with his waking ritual, there was a ceremony for going to bed, called the coucher du roi, and yes, people were invited to attend. Every night, selected members of the court were granted the high honour of watching Louis XIV change into his nightclothes, be blessed by a priest, and lie down in his great gilded bed. There were roles, ranks, and rituals, all governed by the precise etiquette. The grand bedchamber, with its painted ceiling and tapestries, was both his resting place and his final daily stage. Let's talk about that bed. The bed of Louis XIV was not in some far-off private corner of Versailles. It was placed squarely in the centre of his suite on a raised platform, encircled by an ornate balustrade. Think of it like a little stage within a stage. He didn't just sleep there, he reigned from it. It was where he received important guests. It was where official business was sometimes conducted. And yes, it was where he was meant to die. But here's where things get strange. Louis did not sleep there. Not really. That bed, the majestic canopied, embroidered bed, was for ceremony only. After the coucher ended and the room cleared, Louis would often sneak off to a smaller, far less opulent bed in a nearby private room to actually sleep, because even a king needs a few hours without eyes watching him. Still, the illusion had to be maintained. Imagine the routine. A full procession leads him to the ceremonial bed. A doctor checks his condition. A priest offers a brief blessing. The Grand Chamberlain assists with undressing, often before a silent crowd of nobles. His wig is removed, his face bare, his hair let down. Then slowly and with great solemnity, Louis climbs into bed. Silence. Someone draws the curtains. Candles are extinguished one by one, and the king is left there in the soft flicker of a single flame as if the sun had set inside the room itself. Then, as the last guest departs, a trusted servant may return. The curtains are opened again. Louis rises, quietly, and walks to his real bedroom, just a few steps away. He could finally breathe, alone, for a few hours. This odd two-bedroom routine wasn't born entirely of ego. It was a kind of survival. For Louis XIV, solitude was stolen, not given. His entire world was built on performance, so he had to carve out sleep like a thief, slipping into it behind the walls of expectation. And when he did sleep, it was light, fitful. He suffered chronic health issues, gout, dental infections, hemorrhoids, a persistent cough, and perhaps worst of all, the weight of always being seen, always being the sun. How do you rest when your life is a burning performance? There's a story told by one of his valets. On a winter night, the palace grew still. Everyone had left the ceremonial bedchamber. The king had risen to return to his true sleeping quarters, but before he left, he stood by the balcony doors gazing out over the cold moonlit gardens. He said nothing, just stared. Minutes passed, when the valet finally whispered, "Shall I prepare your bed, sire?" Louis responded softly, "Do they ever dream of me, I wonder?" The valet didn't answer. He didn't know how. That one sentence says so much. Louis wasn't just asking if his people remembered him, he was asking if he existed beyond performance, beyond ritual, beyond the endless eyes. Was he a man in their minds, or a symbol? It's easy to forget how young Louis was when the idea of kingship became fused with theatre. He was 5 when his father died. He was 11 during the Fronde, the noble rebellion that nearly shattered France. From those years onward, he learnt that control must be complete, or chaos would creep in. So he built Versailles not just as a home, but as a machine, a sleeping trap, where even rest was staged, where even silence was rehearsed. And let's not forget the sounds of the night. Versailles was never truly quiet. There were guards pacing outside, pages whispering in the hallways, fires crackling in distant rooms. The floors creaked, the wind slipped through window frames. Occasionally, the muffled sob of a dismissed servant or the hushed laughter of a drunken courtier. Even in sleep, Louis was never fully alone. Letters would arrive at midnight. Priests might be summoned at dawn. There were nights when he could barely close his eyes before someone knocked with news from the front, or a request for a blessing or a noble demanding an audience. And yet, he kept the ritual alive, every night without fail, because rituals were the glue. They held the mask in place. They kept the myth alive. When Louis finally did sleep, truly sleep, it was likely in a bed smaller than you'd imagine, in a room darker than any other in the palace, curtains drawn, doors locked, maybe a candle burning low beside him, maybe a book open, unfinished. The Sun King fading briefly into darkness, hoping for dreams where no one watched. And perhaps, just for a few hours, he wasn't Louis XIV. He was simply Louis, the boy who once feared the dark, now surrounded by too much light. A king without witnesses, a man at last. When we imagine Versailles, we picture gleaming chandeliers, polished marble, powdered wigs, and silk rustling in candlelight. But behind that splendour, there was a stench, quite literally. The Palace of Versailles, for all its beauty, had no proper plumbing system for most of Louis XIV's reign. Chamber pots overflowed. Human waste was dumped into corners, behind tapestries or out of windows. The great fountains of the gardens may have sparkled under the sun, but inside, the air was thick. So what did Louis do? He masked it. Not with cleaning, not with soap, but with perfume. Fragrance wasn't just a fashion at Versailles. It was a weapon, a ritual, a necessity. The king himself was a walking bouquet. Daily his valets would rub him with scented oils, ambergris, musk, bergamot, rosewater, jasmine. His gloves were soaked in orange blossom essence. His wigs were dusted with violet powder. Even the soles of his shoes were perfumed. But why so much? Because Louis XIV, for all his grandeur, was not a fan of bathing. That's not a rumour, it's history. The prevailing medical belief in 17th century France was that water, especially hot water, opened the pores and allowed disease to slip inside the body. Doctors advised against full immersion, so Louis and most of his court avoided baths almost entirely. He reportedly bathed fully twice in his entire life. Instead, he preferred dry washing, rubbing the skin with linen cloths, dabbing with alcohol, or wiping down with lightly scented vinegar. This was followed by heavy layers of powder and perfume designed not just to please the nose, but to suppress it. One court physician noted that the king's skin was often discoloured and dry from the constant rubbing and scent layering, but Louis insisted. He couldn't afford to smell mortal, not when his entire identity was built on divine presence. This obsession extended far beyond his body. His entire palace reeked of fragrance. Hallways were lined with bowls of potpourri. Furniture was stuffed with aromatic herbs. Candles weren't just for light. They were scented, often with cinnamon or lilac or pine resin. Even the ink Louis used carried a faint perfume. It's easy to romanticize this, but remember, the perfume was a veil over dirt, illness, rot. The royal apartments were rarely cleaned in the way we understand today. Floors were swept, yes, but disinfected? Hardly. Chamber pots were emptied daily, but their residue lingered. The wooden interiors absorbed decades of scent, and so Louis layered over the truth with olfactory illusion. He even had an official royal perfumer, Jean Valjean, a man who catered to the king's every aromatic whim. Valjean kept detailed journals about the fragrances Louis preferred, how often he changed them, which oils irritated his skin, and how to blend a new scent to match his mood. One day, Louis might want something earthy and masculine, amber, leather, cedar. The next, light and citrusy, neroli, lemon, verbena. His perfume wasn't just for pleasure. It was a signal, a mood, a coded message delivered on the air. There's a story Valjean once told. Louis was about to receive a foreign delegation. He requested a new fragrance, something to remind them of sunlight and heaven. Valjean worked overnight, blending citrus, honey, white rose, and a touch of frankincense. When Louis entered the meeting, the ambassadors reportedly bowed deeper than usual. The perfume had spoken. It told them they weren't meeting a man. They were meeting the sun, but behind that golden scent, a decaying body. Louis XIV, especially in his later years, suffered from a range of health issues that left his body riddled with infection. He had abscesses in his mouth from decades of dental neglect. His teeth were rotting. He suffered from a painful anal fistula that required surgery, a surgery he insisted on turning into a public spectacle of his strength. The palace masked the pain, the odour, the slow unravelling of flesh with rose petals and sandalwood. In a way, Versailles was like a corpse in a silk dress, elegant, powerful, intoxicating, but underneath, deteriorating. And Louis knew this. He embraced it, because illusion to him wasn't deception, it was control. If his enemies saw a glistening court, a fragrant king, a world without blemish, then they believed it. Versailles became a kind of sensory trap. Diplomats, nobles, artists, they all came and left bewitched by the scent, unable to smell the truth beneath it. Even within the court, certain rooms were designated for perfumed reception. Louis would receive guests only after they had passed through 3 or 4 fragrant spaces, scented corridors, incense-filled vestibules, so by the time they reached him, their senses were softened, their guard lowered. It worked. Visitors would write home in wonder, "The king smells like heaven." And he did, because he couldn't smell like earth. Earth was for mortals, and Louis was trying to become immortal. There's something tragic about that a man so powerful, so feared, so revered, was terrified of his own odour, of his own body betraying him, of the stink of death rising from within and undermining the mask he wore each day, so he drowned it. Not in water, but in roses and musk. His courtiers followed suit. Soon all of Versailles reeked of artificial beauty. Scented wigs, scented letters, scented floors. Some rooms were so layered in incense and perfume that visitors fainted. One noble woman had to be carried out of a banquet because the smell of lilac oil made her ill. But no one dared suggest a change, because to smell anything less than divine was to risk revealing the truth. The king was human. The palace was fallible. The sun could rot too. So Versailles continued to shimmer in gold and reek of lilies, and Louis, in his perfumed silence, kept the illusion alive, even as his body broke down, even as his breath turned sour, even as the sweet, cloying scent of immortality clung to a dying man. By day, Louis XIV belonged to France. By night, and he belonged to his passions. Versailles may have been a palace of etiquette, ritual, and political control, but beneath its gold-leafed surface pulsed a very different rhythm, one of secret rendezvous, whispered promises, and velvet soft footsteps down hidden corridors. Because for all his obsession with public ritual, the king kept secrets too, and the most carefully guarded of those were the women he loved. Let's start with the architecture. Versailles was designed for surveillance, yes, but also for escape. Behind every grand salon and royal chamber, there were hidden passages. Some led to servant quarters, others were built for fire safety, but a select few were for pleasure. Unmarked doors disguised as panelling, narrow staircases built between walls, and private routes that allowed the king to vanish from his official quarters and reappear elsewhere. These weren't accidents, they were intentional, and they were used frequently. One of the most famous secret doors in the palace led directly from Louis's official bedchamber to the apartments of Madame de Montespan, the woman who had become the most powerful and scandalous mistress of his reign. At the height of her influence, Montespan wasn't just a lover. She was his shadow queen. She bore him 7 children. She dined with him. She whispered advice into his ear in the dark and watched him rule by daylight. But she did not live with him. She waited, in soft-lit rooms filled with tapestries, mirrors, and perfumes of her own. Her private apartment was decorated in deep reds, symbolic of both passion and power. And sometimes, when the palace slept, the king would slip through the wall and knock gently on her door. And so began one of the strangest dualities in Louis's life. The man who lived in front of hundreds by day lived in shadows by night. He was not ashamed of his mistresses, not exactly, but he understood the danger of too much transparency. Affairs were one thing, a parade of lovers undermining the sanctity of marriage and monarchy, that was another, so he hid strategically. And this wasn't just one relationship. Louis had many mistresses, official, semi-official, and purely rumoured. Some were married noblewomen whose husbands turned a blind eye for favour at court. Others were lower-born women elevated to grandeur by the king's attention. His tastes varied. He enjoyed wit as much as beauty. He liked a woman who could charm a room and then challenge him in private. Some, like Madame de Maintenon, became deeply spiritual influences. Others, like Louise de la Vallière, fell into sadness and religious guilt. Montespan, for her part, became legendary for her extravagance, her cleverness, and later, her suspected involvement in the infamous affair of the poisons, where allegations of black magic and love potions nearly brought down the entire court. Yes, love potions. It was whispered that Montespan had a personal apothecary who supplied her with aphrodisiacs and spells. Some said she offered the king enchanted wine. Others claimed she had bathed in the blood of infants to maintain his desire. Absurd? Maybe, but the rumours were enough that she was eventually forced to withdraw from court. And Louis, ever the performer, moved on to a quieter flame, Madame de Maintenon, his final companion, whom he likely married in secret. Still, the architecture remained. The doors, the passages, the ritual of disappearing into silk-draped night. There's something deeply human about this. The idea that even the most powerful man in the world needed to slip away. To feel warmth without politics. To kiss without ceremony. To touch without being watched. And yet, even these moments were performances of a kind. Servants lit the corridors ahead of him. Valets waited outside the mistress's doors. Sometimes gifts, jewels, letters, poems would arrive hours before Louis did, as if preparing the stage for a scene to come. And of course the women played their parts too. They knew when to be coy, when to flatter, when to remain silent. They competed for affection, not just emotionally, but politically. Being the king's favourite wasn't about love. It was about power, influence, the ability to shape policy from behind a veil of velvet. But what did it cost? For them, almost everything. Few of Louis's mistresses left unscathed. Some ended in convents. Others were married off quietly to distant nobles. Montespan, once the most brilliant woman at Versailles, died in relative obscurity. Estranged from the court she once ruled from behind the curtain. And for Louis, desire was always bound to strategy. He never let his heart rule entirely. He could be affectionate, even tender, but always with calculation. He gave affection the way he gave land, with conditions. Still there were moments, rare, quiet, unrecorded, where the mask must have slipped, where he whispered words not meant for politics, where he brushed hair from a lover's face and forgot briefly that he was the Sun King, where he closed the hidden door behind him and didn't think about who would talk or what they'd say, or how history would remember it. Because Versailles could be beautiful and terrifying, but in the dark, in the hidden rooms, it could be intimate, and maybe that's what he craved most. Not scandal, not conquest, comme d'est, just one space where he wasn't being watched. But here's the irony. These hidden doors, the ones built to keep his private life safe, are now among the most visited parts of Versailles. Tourists pass through them every day. Guides tell stories of secret affairs, of trembling lovers, of silk slippers left beside the bed, the privacy he fought so hard to maintain. Gone, only the stories remain. Faint echoes of footsteps behind the walls, a hidden door slightly ajar, a king desperate to be touched like a man, not worshipped like a god. We tend to imagine kings as immortal. Not literally, of course, but when you picture Louis XIV, You likely see the powdered wig, the rich robes, the strong, commanding gaze, the Sun King, radiant and untouchable, surrounded by beauty and brilliance. But that image was a carefully painted mask. Behind it was a man in constant, often horrifying pain, and worse, a man who turned that pain into a public ritual. Let's begin with one of the strangest chapters in medical history, Louis XIV's anal fistula. Yes, it sounds awkward, but for 17th century France, it became a matter of national obsession. In 1686, the king developed what was delicately called a fistule anale, an infected tunnel near the anus, causing extreme pain, bleeding and swelling. It made sitting, walking and even sleeping a torment. But here's where it gets bizarre. Rather than retreat into privacy or shield his suffering, Louis turned the treatment of this deeply personal ailment into yet another public performance. Surgeons were summoned, not one but several, some from across Europe. And though surgery at the time was brutal, unsanitary and performed without anaesthesia, Louis insisted on being operated on at Versailles, with an audience. Why? Ego? Ritual? A warped sense of duty? Perhaps all three. On November 18, 1686, surgeon Charles-François Félix performed the procedure. He had spent months practicing on prisoners no less, perfecting a special curved scalpel just for the king. When the day arrived, the king lay face down in bed, surrounded by courtiers and physicians. Félix cut into him, drained the infection and inserted a tube for healing. Louis didn't scream, he didn't faint. He endured it like a saint, and for that he was praised in sermons and poems. The operation became a national event. Healing pamphlets were printed, fistula-themed songs were composed, portraits were painted to commemorate the king's courage. Think about that. The king's rectal surgery became propaganda, proof of his divine strength, and to celebrate, nobles across France began faking similar symptoms, hoping to show their loyalty by needing the same operation. That's the Versailles effect. It wasn't just that the king's life was public, it's that every suffering, every bodily function, every scar became part of the national myth, and Louis played the part perfectly. You might think he resented the exposure, but in many ways he thrived on it. His body was not private, it was political property, a symbol of the state. To show it bleeding, healing, enduring, was to show France's power. But the fistula was only the beginning. Throughout his life, Louis suffered from a staggering list of ailments: chronic dental infections, severe gout, boils, migraines, intestinal issues, recurring fevers, and a particularly foul-smelling leg ulcer that never fully healed. One visitor wrote that the king's breath was so rancid from rotting teeth that courtiers had to stand at a distance when speaking with him. He lost most of his teeth by middle age. Meals were sometimes mashed or soaked in broth so he could swallow. His body in all its grandeur was decaying while still being worshipped. And yet, he remained deeply obsessed with appearances. His face was caked in white powder to hide blemishes. His high-heeled shoes masked the shrinking caused by age. He wore gloves soaked in scented oils to counteract the stench from his wounds. Even his wigs, fluffy and grand, were carefully arranged to disguise thinning hair and sagging skin. And as with everything in Louis's world, his medical care was full of contradiction. He had access to the finest physicians in Europe, and yet many of their treatments were worse than the diseases: bleeding, leeching, mercury, enemas, so many enemas. The king reportedly received over 2,000 enemas during his lifetime. Let that number settle in. This wasn't just medical, it was ritualistic. Enemas were believed to balance the humours, to purify the soul, and yes, to prepare the king for daily public appearances. It wasn't uncommon for him to receive one before a major event. Imagine that, purged, perfumed, powdered, then presented like a living icon. It gets stranger. During serious illness, Louis sometimes insisted that his bowel movements be examined by court doctors, in full view. Why? Because the king's health was a matter of national concern. His digestion, urination, pulse, every bodily sign was recorded, studied, debated. The body was no longer his, it belonged to France. But through all of this, through the pain, the degradation, the endless treatments, Louis remained stoic, regal, a performer to the last breath. Even as his body broke down, he refused to let the illusion of power slip. In the final years of his life, he could barely walk. He suffered from gangrene in his leg, which slowly blackened and rotted the flesh. The smell was reportedly unbearable. Still, he held council meetings from his bed, fully dressed in royal robes, propped up by pillows, speaking with clarity and control. It was theatre, pure theatre. And then, in 1715, it ended. Louis XIV died in Versailles at the age of 76, an astonishing lifespan for someone who endured so much physical torment. His body, once revered, was dissected. His heart, as was custom, removed and preserved in alcohol. His bowels placed in a separate urn. And the rest? Laid to rest in the Saint-Denis Basilica. But even in death, the illusion cracked. Years later, revolutionaries stormed Saint-Denis. They desecrated royal tombs. Louis's body was exhumed, stripped, and thrown into a mass grave, his carefully maintained image swallowed by the very people he had once ruled like a god. So what do we take from this? That kings are human? That pain makes us equal? Oh, yes, in part, but more than that. Louis XIV turned his suffering into a performance just like everything else. He didn't hide it, he curated it, framed it, used it, because he understood something fundamental. Power isn't just about strength. Sometimes it's about how well you bleed in public. And Louis XIV, he bled magnificently. You'd think a king who lived in such splendor would eat like a god. And in a sense, Louis XIV did, lavishly, publicly, and excessively, but not always for pleasure. At Versailles, even the act of eating was political theatre. The king's meals were ceremonies in themselves, not cosy family affairs, not moments of indulgence in private, but performances called Le Grand Couvert, the Great Covering. Every day, usually around 10 a hunt in the morning and again at night, Louis would eat in the presence of dozens, sometimes hundreds of spectators. Yes, spectators. You didn't need to be noble to attend. All you needed was the right clothing, and the guards might let you in. Merchants, travellers, even beggars who dressed the part could stand silently and watch the king chew, sip, and swallow. Why? Because the king's body was the body of France. His nourishment symbolized the health of the state. His ability to eat well, lavishly in the public, was meant to reflect France's abundance. His appetite was national pride on display. But here's where it gets odd. Though the food was decadent, the act of eating was anything but relaxed. Let's paint the scene. The king enters the dining hall, often accompanied by music. He sits at an enormous table, placed beneath rich tapestries and chandeliers. He's flanked by servers, each with a specific role, each of noble blood. Plates arrive one by one, gold utensils, porcelain-decked dishes, crystal goblets. Dishes sometimes flavoured with rosewater, cinnamon and gold leaf. Yet Louis often sat alone. His family might join from time to time, but even then they'd sit at a lower table. The main meal, Le Grand Couvert, was about spectacle, not social connection. And the food? Oh, the food. Boiled meats, roast pheasants, sausages, truffles, artichokes, glazed fruits, stuffed quail and more. One report from a typical supper noted 4 soups, 2 whole shoulders of mutton, a pheasant, a partridge, a salad, pastries and jams, just for the king, but there was a twist. Louis rarely finished anything. He ate with speed and discipline. Despite the scale of the meals, he was surprisingly moderate. He'd sample a little here, a little there, and move on. He hated overeating and often walked after meals to aid digestion. Yet for all his moderation, the spectacle never shrank. And the rules? Endless. Food could only be served by certain ranked nobles, down to the man who placed the napkin on his lap. Water for washing hands had to be carried in gold basins. The bread must be fresh, white, and precisely sliced. Wine had to be uncorked before him, tasted for poison, then presented with the appropriate bow. This wasn't about nourishment. This was choreography, and it didn't end with the meal. Afterward, pages would clear the table, servers would whisper their exits, and the king might rise, nod, and leave without a word. The entire ritual was designed to show order, wealth, and power, all radiating from his fork. Now let's step back from the Bible. Because not everything Louis ate came with roses and truffles. He had bizarre cravings, especially in his younger years. He was known to devour large quantities of bread soaked in wine, and he had a fondness for garlic-heavy dishes, despite the court's obsession with perfume and breath. And though he detested drunkenness, he often drank a bottle of wine with each meal, diluted with water but steady nonetheless. He also believed, like many at the time, that certain foods could balance the humours, cure illness, or lift melancholy. In one strange episode, he reportedly consumed large amounts of asparagus, and boiled leeks at the advice of a court physician trying to drain the bile. Meals were sometimes interrupted for enemas, yes, even during feasts, if the king was feeling sluggish or off balance. And when ill, special diet meals were prepared: boiled chicken without seasoning, crushed prunes, barley water, and medicinal broths. Still, the strangest part of Louis's relationship with food was how public it always was. When he wasn't eating in front of courtiers, he was being watched as he fasted. On holy days, when he took communion or observed religious fasts, Versailles quieted. Servants whispered. Visitors watched with awe. It was as if his restraint was just as symbolic as his indulgence. Fasting, feasting, every forkful, every crumb was intentional messaging. Even the kitchen was a palace. The royal kitchens of Versailles were vast, almost city-like. Dozens of chefs, bakers, sauce makers, and butchers worked round the clock. Fires roared, ovens steamed. Every ingredient, every pot had a hierarchy of supervision. Spoiled food, grounds for scandal. Overcooked meat, grounds for demotion. And the waste, immense, because the king ate only what he liked. Most of the meal, prepared for spectacle, was discarded or sent to lower nobles. Leftovers trickled down the hierarchy, from dukes to servants, sometimes reaching the village outside the gates. But make no mistake, the feast was not about taste. It was about control. Louis once said, "I see all," and in truth he wanted to be seen. Every moment of his life was a reflection of his power, and food, more than any other ritual, was a symbol of divine authority. At his table, the king did not just dine, he ruled. By the time the Sun King reached the end of his life, the performance hadn't stopped. If anything, it had become more rigid, more ceremonial, more hollow. Louis XIV had turned Versailles into a machine of rituals, and by the final years of his reign, he was no longer the engine, but merely a gear within it. Let's begin with a simple truth. Louis XIV never truly lived alone. He was never without watchers, followers, admirers. And yet, in his final days, he grew strangely solitary, even within the crowd. He died in the palace he built, surrounded by courtiers trained to watch his every breath, every blink, every sign of mortal frailty. But the man who once rose each morning to dozens of nobles crowding his bedchamber now spent hours in pain, his leg rotting from gangrene, trying to maintain his dignity in the only way he knew how, by clinging to ritual. Even death had to be majestic. He continued to follow a form of the lever, his waking ceremony, even when he could barely sit upright. Doctors, surgeons, priests and noblemen came in shifts. He was swaddled in lace and satin even as infection festered beneath it. The public body of the king, that sacred image of power, had to be maintained, even when the private body was failing. But here's the strange part. The palace didn't slow down. Versailles continued to whirl. Musicians played. Candles burned all night. Ministers met. Meals were served. Dancers rehearsed. Because the true legacy of Louis XIV wasn't just in his habits. It was in the habits he left behind. Let's zoom out a bit. Versailles was not just a home, it was an idea. It was built to absorb and tame the nobility, to centralize power not through war, but through distraction. Hunting trips, masked balls, gift-giving, endless rules of etiquette. Louis turned powerful lords into ornamental furniture, dressing them in lace and keeping them too busy with court gossip to plot rebellion. And it worked. But what happens when the king behind it all begins to fade? What happens when the habits become hollow? Louis felt it. In his final weeks, he summoned his great-grandson, the future Louis XV, and gave him a whisper of warning. "Do not imitate me in my fondness for building, nor in my love of war." A strange confession from a man who spent decades drenching Europe in blood and gold. But maybe that's what happens when the curtain falls. You begin to see the stage for what it was. Even his death was orchestrated. When the moment came, on September the 1st, 1715, the palace mourned him like clockwork. Bells rang. Black drapes covered the windows. The deathbed ritual was followed meticulously. Holy oils, final prayers, a royal surgeon standing by to embalm the body with surgical care. But his heart, his entrails, his body, they were all buried separately as tradition demanded. Versailles itself seemed to sigh, but it did not stop. The king's rituals, his lever, his couchy, his formal dinners, his secret walks, his stage conversations, his rigid schedules, they didn't vanish. They became the blueprint. Courtiers still vied for access to the next king's bedroom. The garden still hosted festivals designed to impress foreign dignitaries. The etiquette manuals grew thicker, the rules multiplied, and in this strange way Louis XIV lived on, not as a man, but as a system, and the system was suffocating. Louis XV, though crowned with all the inherited rituals of his great-grandfather, quickly tired of the constant performance. He sought privacy, retreating to smaller, more intimate spaces like the Petit Trianon. Where Louis XIV had made everything public, Louis XV craved quiet. It was as if the Sun King's shadow had become too heavy to bear, but Versailles never truly escaped it. Even when revolution loomed, decades later, the palace still echoed with the footsteps of Louis XIV's routines. Servants still opened and closed curtains at precise times. The gardens were still trimmed to his obsessive standards. The furniture still arranged in angles he had once approved. He was dead, yes, but his habits had colonized the building. Even now, if you visit Versailles, you can feel it. Stand in the Hall of Mirrors. There's a hum, a stillness, like something's been rehearsed there too many times. It's not haunted in the ghostly sense. It's haunted by discipline. Every room is a reflection of control. Every hallway, a memory of movement. Every chandelier, a reminder that Louis XIV didn't just rule for France. He choreographed it. Let's take one last quiet moment and remember how deep this went. He changed the fashion of a continent, not to look beautiful, but to create visual hierarchy. He orchestrated bedtime and wake-up as state rituals. He turned mealtimes into statecraft, where chewing became a show of strength. He trained nobles to fight over the privilege of holding his shirt. He made even walking through a door a question of class and status, and when he died, none of it died with him. Because the strangest habit of all, the one no one speaks of, is that Louis XIV turned a palace into a person. He gave Versailles a personality, a clockwork mind, a hunger for routine, a love for watching and being watched. To this day it watches still, and if you found tonight's journey as strange and soothing as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more quiet corners of forgotten history. It helps more than you know. Now, close your eyes, let the halls of Versailles fade into darkness. You've earned your rest. Good night, and I'll see you in the next story.